Brett Kavanaugh finally speaks. Today, for the first time since Brett Kavanaugh has been facing an accusation of sexual assault, we heard from Brett Kavanaugh in his own words, and he said, "I will be there." But here is what he did not say. I demand an FBI investigation. I demand an FBI investigation so that I can clear my name. He didn't say that. In his letter to Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee today, Brett Kavanaugh, in writing, accepted the invitation to appear before the committee on Monday, and he said, "I continue to want a hearing as soon as possible so that I can clear my name." And he could have also said, "I continue to want an FBI investigation as soon as possible so that I can clear my name." But with that letter, Brett Kavanaugh made it very, very clear that he personally does not want an FBI investigation, because he had an opportunity to say it right there and he didn't. And until we heard from him directly in his own words, we could only surmise that he did not want an FBI investigation. But now we know. And we know that Professor Christine Blasey Ford does still want an FBI investigation. And we also know that Dr. Ford will not be there Monday, because in a letter from Dr. Ford's attorney, Deborah Katz, to Chuck Grassley, sent hours before Brett Kavanaugh's letter was sent, she said she wishes to testify provided that we can agree on terms that are fair and which ensure her safety. A hearing on Monday is not possible, and the committee's insistence that it occur then is arbitrary in any event. Deborah Katz canceled her appearance on Rachel's show tonight, citing, quote, active efforts to reach agreement with the committee. And so the negotiations are underway, and Chuck Grassley's threatened 10 a.m. deadline tomorrow for Dr. Ford's decision about whether she would testify on Monday is no longer a deadline. The truth is, there are no deadlines in this story, none. There are no time restrictions. The hearing does not have to be next week. It does not have to be this month, as every member of the Republican Senate proved when they deliberately kept a Supreme Court seat vacant for over a year. NBC News is reporting tonight that the negotiations are considering the possibility of Thursday as a potential hearing date, but that is not yet settled. NBC News is also reporting that Dr. Ford does not want Brett Kavanaugh in the room when she testifies. And Dr. Ford is asking that Brett Kavanaugh testify first. And Dr. Ford would like other witnesses to testify, including the man she says was an eyewitness and participant in the attack on her, Mark Judge, who might have to be subpoenaed because he has told the committee in writing through his attorney that he never witnessed or participated in anything like the assault Dr. Ford describes, and he does not want to be questioned by anyone about that. The Republicans apparently are discussing the possibility of hiring an outside counsel to ask the questions in the committee. Dr. Ford does not want the committee to hire an outside counsel for the Republicans to ask the questions instead of the senators. And that means that the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee seem to realize just how bad they will look as a group of 11 men questioning a woman about a delicate subject. Some of them must realize just how bad the Republicans looked in that same committee when they attacked Anita Hill.
And it bothers me because she appears to believe everything that she said. And I myself don't want to call her a liar. But as an old trial lawyer, I have seen witnesses just like that who believe every word they say, and every word is absolutely wrong, and we've proven it wrong, and they still believe it.
That man who didn't want to call Anita Hill a liar is a liar himself tonight. Said he didn't want to call Anita Hill a liar, and then he called her a liar. He went on to describe Anita Hill right there, as you heard him describe her, as some kind of hysterical, pathological liar. A liar who still thinks it's true even after we prove to her that what she's saying is not true. Orrin Hatch never, ever, ever proved Anita Hill wrong, never. And now Orrin Hatch is lying to his voters in Utah, who have kept him in the United States Senate for way too long. And he's lying to the country when he says we don't have time for an FBI investigation, and when he tells the lie that there is no reason for the FBI to investigate this new information.
I want you to order an FBI investigation. I want an investigation by real, appropriate, non-Senate staffers. I want some people who aren't affiliated with the Senate to look into this matter, because I think that's the only way we even have the slightest chance anyway of getting to the bottom of it.
That's why I was struck with Rachel's generosity and calling what Orrin Hatch is saying now an argument. What Orrin Hatch is saying now is a lie. And the person who proves Orrin Hatch is lying now is Orrin Hatch then. Because back then, Orrin Hatch didn't want Senate staffers to do the investigation. No, not Senate staffers. He says he wanted real, appropriate, non-Senate staffers. And you're going to find out why that's a very good idea, to have real, appropriate, non-Senate staffers do the investigation just a moment from now. Because we found out today and last night what the Republican Senate staffers and the Judiciary Committee are trying to do and what they're trying to do to Dr. Ford. Orrin Hatch is still on that committee, and Republicans are terrified tonight, rightly so, that Orrin Hatch will be allowed to ask questions of a woman accuser in the Senate Judiciary Committee once again. They are terrified of how that will look. And they should be. But Dr. Ford and her lawyers seem to want America to see the Republican Judiciary Committee for what it is, a group of close-minded men who have already made up their minds. And it is not just the senators, it is the Republican staff of the Judiciary Committee. In Brett Kavanaugh's letter to Chuck Grassley today, he noted that he has been interviewed this week by the Republican staff of the Judiciary Committee. The Democratic staff of the committee did not participate in those interviews. And last night, the Judiciary Committee's Republican chief counsel for nominations tweeted this: unfazed and determined, will confirm Judge Kavanaugh. And he followed that tweet with this one: I personally question Judge Kavanaugh under penalty of felony and 5 years of imprisonment if he lies. I'm still waiting to hear back from the accuser's attorneys who can't find time between TV appearances to get back to me. That's Mike Davis. Mike Davis is a poisonously prejudiced staffer who is determined to confirm Judge Kavanaugh, and he has not heard one word from Dr. Ford. And he doesn't have to, because he knows the job that Chuck Grassley has given him is to make sure Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed. And we know about these tweets because our first guest tonight, former Senate staffer Adam Gentleson, found them and brought them to public attention, whereupon the tweets were deleted because they are outrageous. But Mike Davis is still determined, and Chuck Grassley is still determined, and Orrin Hatch is still determined, and every Republican man who is a member of the Judiciary Committee is still determined to confirm Brett Kavanaugh. And they are willing, all of them, to tell any lie to do it. Every single one of them. Every single Republican member of the committee and every Republican member of the Senate has collectively joined in the big lie that there is no role for the FBI in this investigation. Every one of them has joined in the big lie that this nomination must be voted on quickly. And so Dr. Ford knows that if she walks into the Judiciary Committee hearing, she will be walking into a room where more than half of the senators are determined to disregard every word that she says. And Mike Davis and all those Republican staffers will be sitting behind the senators in that hearing room with exactly the same determination. Those staffers all take the same oath of office as those senators. It is an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And it is an oath to faithfully discharge the duties of the office. Mike Davis has violated his oath of office. Mike Davis would be fired for publicly saying that he is determined to confirm Judge Kavanaugh before he has heard accusations against Judge Kavanaugh if Mike Davis was employed by a senator who still took his oath seriously. If Chuck Grassley took his oath of office seriously, he would have fired Mike Davis already. But Chuck Grassley's lying knows no bounds now. He has crossed a line with that. And I didn't think that about Chuck Grassley or Orrin Hatch when I was working with them on the Senate Finance Committee and when I was in the Democratic staff in the 1990s. And I never dreamed there would come a day where I would prove either of those men were outright liars just by playing video of what they said about exactly the same thing in the past. The proof that Chuck Grassley is lying now about the FBI investigation is what Chuck Grassley said in support of the FBI investigation of Anita Hill. Same thing with Orrin Hatch. I showed you that video last night of both of them. Dr. Ford knows she's going into a rigged hearing with a majority of the senators who have already made up their minds about her testimony before hearing a word of it. And she doesn't want those senators to be allowed to hire an outside counsel to save them from doing their own dirty work on television. Reports indicate Republicans are looking for a woman lawyer to hire to do that for them. There isn't a single woman member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, not one. And now those men on the Republican side of the Judiciary Committee want to hire a woman as an outside counsel to sit there beside the Chairman Grassley and save all of those men from humiliating themselves, as most of them surely will, if Dr. Ford can come to an agreement with Chuck Grassley about when and how to conduct a hearing that is more fair than staffers like Mike Davis and senators like Chuck Grassley and Orrin Hatch have proven themselves capable of delivering. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.